My project dealing with the Lighthouse Society passport program has taken a few little turns because of some trips that I was able to make earlier last month. And of course, having been able to talk to one or two people with the Lighthouse Society, I'm able to better focus a lot of the things that I am trying to do. So with the United States Lighthouse Society passport program, sometimes a lot of these lighthouses are easier to get to than some others are. When I went to Baltimore, the two lighthouses there that were in the Inner Harbor area were pretty easy to reach. One of them was at a lightship, and the other one was at a lighthouse called the 7 Foot Knolls Lighthouse. And that lighthouse is visible. It's a nice big red, somewhat large red building that sits there. But of course, the passport stamp that you get, you need to go to one of the ships in the harbor there named the Taney in order to get it. One of the interesting things about that prospect was the day that I was actually going to get my passport stamp there at the Taney, it was pouring rain outside there in Baltimore. And I thought, well, I'll just slip my passport in my inner pocket here in my coat, and then I'll just run down to the harbor. It's about 10-minute walk, or 15 minutes technically, to walk down there. And if I run, I might be able to be less wet when I get there. And of course, when I went down, I ran in that direction. I was really pounded really hard with rain. And by the time I got to the Taney, I pulled out my passport and noticed that it had actually gotten a bit wet, and there was a good deal of smearing on one of the pages there that kind of ticked me off. And the stamp that had to deal with Alcatraz had faded so that you couldn't read it anymore. So I had to go write the word Alcatraz Island on there so that anyone looking at it would know that that's what it was. It was obvious that some stamp was there. You just couldn't see which one it was. But when I got to the Taney, I was dripping wet, and they did stamp my passport for me, and they actually let me stay there on the Taney rather than having to pay to see it. And I have to admit, a lot of these ships that they have sitting here in the harbors, they are really interesting to walk through and see how ships were built earlier in this century. The ship, the Constellation, also sits in that harbor. Not the Constitution, but the Constellation. That is in Baltimore Harbor. And so this ship actually is supposed to be haunted, but of course I wasn't able to get into it or to see it at night to see what might be coming up at that time. But what's interesting about it is this one dates back to Civil War times like the Constitution does, and I found it really fascinating, even just looking at it from the outside. When you're standing there in Baltimore Harbor, it's hard to imagine how things might have been before all these buildings came up. And of course, these lighthouses and that lightship, named the Chesapeake, is something that, obviously where it's sitting in the harbor, it can't possibly be used as a lighthouse to, make safe passage into the harbor. It stopped being used for that purpose a couple decades ago, but it was an interesting looking ship. I was able to have a look at, the top deck and a couple other things. They told me, oh, if you want to have a good look at the ship, it's going to cost you money. And of course, when I was there for the American Folklore Society meeting, I definitely did not have a whole lot of money. And I just didn't think that paying that much money to walk through that one single ship wouldn't be a great idea. Granted, they said that if you paid a certain amount, you could walk through all 4 ships in the harbor, but we were kind of a bit scrumped for cash because we had come from Boston to Baltimore, and suddenly realized what our tab was turning into. We had all planned, of course, to use the cash we had on hand, but then we found ourselves using credit cards. But basically, the point of this, it comes down to these lighthouses were available to get to just being in downtown Baltimore, right by the harbor where the Star Spangled Banner was written by Francis Scott Key. And you can easily just walk around and see those two things as well as the other ships docked there. Now, the lighthouses in Boston and the Boston Harbor, those are not so easily reached. So there are 3 lighthouses in Boston Harbor where you can get stamps, or what you can get stamps for. I do understand that there's several other lighthouses in Boston Harbor. There are just only 3 where you can actually get a stamp to put in your passport. When I was in Boston, I was walking around some parts of Boston, and I made it a point to get to an area where I could overlook part of the harbor there. And Boston Harbor, of course, is a very fascinating place. I can't wait to actually go back there. I do want to go back to Boston sometime to see a whole bunch of other historical sites. I will probably want to visit the Boston Harbor Islands National Park, where the lighthouses exist as well. But any visitor to Boston would be a fool not to see a bunch of things dealing with the American Revolution and possibly the Civil War as well. I was able to get to a part where I could stand up on a kind of ledge by one of the buildings. Well, I was standing up on a hill, I guess, near a building, and I could look out towards the harbor area. I couldn't, of course, see the whole harbor because there were a lot of buildings blocking my view. But looking out across there, you could see some of the water, and I was able to see one of the islands in the distance there, and you could see a teeny little building sticking up off the top of that hill. I tried zooming in with my phone camera and everything, but I knew that I couldn't possibly get a good shot of it. But that was one of the lighthouses. That's called the Boston Harbor Light. I'm not sure why that one gets that special name while the others don't, but anyways, it just reminds me that I really need to be able to get back there to see a bunch of things, because there's just so much maritime history there that is really amazing. It dates back to the 1600s when the first settlers showed up in America. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was the second colony from England to land on Plymouth Rock. Well, Plymouth was one of the areas that they landed. And just seeing the sea and seeing a lot of the buildings that look archaic, they're old. I mean, I know they don't date back to the 17th century, but they just gives you an impression of this is living history. And if you go around other parts of Boston, they really push the feel that this is the birthplace of the American Revolution. There's a lot of fascinating stuff there. Maritime history in America is centered around Boston a lot of the time. And of course, when you went from Massachusetts, you go to Maine and up into Canada and back. It's really fascinating maritime history of Massachusetts. Seeing these lighthouses, then, this is the first time I had actually been in the east coast of the United States, other than as a bounce off to go somewhere else. And so many things are not quite how I imagined them. I trying to think if you can say if they were better or not, but looking back into the ancient records to look at the old frameworks, the old structures, and the relics of things like the old fishing traditions that date back in the early American settling period is something that was certainly worth the trip. Even though my conference for the Folklore Society was in Baltimore, there in Massachusetts, in Boston, was an absolute wonder to see. It's just too bad that I was only able to stay there for a couple days before going on to Baltimore. This is my experience, of course, with the lighthouses and a couple other things on the East Coast. I was glad that I was finally able to get me some stamps in my passport that were on the other side of the country and not just in California. I mean, it's not that I only have them from the West Coast, but I also only have them from California, at least until I went to Buffalo for the Folklore Society meeting last year. And there are some lighthouses there on Lake Erie, and I was able to get those stamps last year, but it didn't quite feel the same or quite as exciting as my visit here to the Atlantic coast of the United States. The lighthouses in Buffalo are really interesting. I just wish that I could have been able to get a little closer to them. My problem was that I was kind of stuck there by one of the areas of the Erie Canal, and though I could go to some areas around there, and I can see Niagara Falls and a few other things. The lighthouses themselves, apparently you had to drive to go over these bridges and stuff to get to, and I was never able to get in a car to go over the bridge. I took a train to go somewhere where I knew I could see one, but unfortunately there was a levee there that I could not cross. I'm not going to dive in there and swim across to the other side to go see that lighthouse, even though it did look pretty close by. But the lighthouses in Buffalo looked similar to a lot of the ones that I also saw in California, except their bottom structures were a little bit different. And it could have something to do with the foundations that they're in. I'll have to ask somebody sometime about that. Since this project has to do with the passport program, I just wanted to mention this because I wanted you all to know essentially where I've been in getting these stamps. When I was talking last time, I had only really found stamps in California. The ones in California are certainly interesting. The Point Reyes Lighthouse is in a really interesting location. It looks up on a cliff out over the ocean. Point Reyes Lighthouse is north of San Francisco, and those of you who've seen Northern California can know just how beautiful the ocean views are there, and I especially love it when the fog is there. And so when these lighthouses give off their light, I'm, of course, blown away about the majesty that the ocean brings. I'm hoping that I will be able to go and visit places like on the Oregon coast or further up the Northern California coast. The further north you go in California, the farther apart each lighthouse is because the towns are a lot smaller. And each of these towns where the lighthouses are found in Northern California, the locals make a big deal out of them being an integral part of the local community. Not every one of those towns on the coast is like a seaport type place, but the lighthouses there, a lot of times, just sitting there by having that lighthouse there, you probably take it for granted and never go see it too much, which could possibly be the case. But when those things are lit up at night, it's always a spectacular sight. In California, I was only able to see a couple of them actually at night, showing off their lights, displaying their lights out into the ocean. The sense that you get when you go to these lighthouses is one of kind of a majestic sense of awe. Like, this light represents something, a safe harbor or safety. It implies a safe passage to the sailors who happen to go by there. The lighthouses are lit up to protect the sailors, the ships, from crashing into rocks or exposed reefs that might just be barely below the surface. And each one of these, being in its own unique place, will also be a nice pull to have you go and seek out other lighthouses. So even if they are there on the California coast, and even if the coast might look kind of similar, it's still going to stand out as its own unique situation, its own unique location. You can look out at the ocean and see why it is that it was essential that this lighthouse be put here. this is probably where I'm going to end this new aspect of my research into the Lighthouse Society. When I present my most current findings here to the Folklore Society of Utah here this year, I do plan to present a lot of images of pictures I have taken, as well as the kinds of things that people have told me about how they feel about the lighthouses, and also how they feel about the passport stamps program. Until you're actually going and doing this, you probably don't really understand why people would go out of their way to do this, but it is truly something that could really catch fire inside you, and you find yourself doing weird things in order to get those stamps. That'll become really relevant and obvious to you once I am able to talk to more people and actually get information from other people who are also out there to get these stamps.